Welcome to our podcast. We're so excited to have you along for this journey. My name is Madison, and I'm the Executive Director of Peace Restored. I will be your host as we discuss mental health and faith in our podcast. Seeking Healing, Finding Hope is a production of Peace Restored, a 501c3 nonprofit located in Indiana and serving women everywhere. So today in our studio, I have with me Rebekah Gilmore. She is on staff with us here at Peace Restored, and she is our class facilitator and also works as a counseling intern with us. She is currently attending Liberty University, and so we're excited to have her with us. If you haven't been listening to our previous podcast, you should go back and listen to the series on boundaries, especially because Becca has become our resident expert on boundaries here at Peace Restored. She's led several classes and groups on boundaries, and now she's been helping us not only facilitate the Boundaries podcast, but she writes it too. So she's, like I said, she's become our expert on this topic. I think she probably knows the most out of all of us. So
I don't know about that. I'm learning with you.
Yeah, she's done a really deep dive into the boundaries material. So I'm excited to have you back in, and we're going to jump in and talk about some more. So thanks for coming back and joining us again today.
Thanks.
Yeah. All right. So what can you do a quick recap of what we talked about this last time on our podcast with the audience?
So for the last episode, we discussed a couple of conflicts between boundaries with friends. We talked about relationships when there's two people that are both compliant. And then the second one we talked about where one person's compliant and then there's an aggressive controller, I believe it was.
Yes.
So we talked about the roots of those, where that comes from, and then some action steps to kind of work through that too.
Yeah, so we tried to give a little bit of define what they are, how it affects you, where did it come from, and then how do you move forward. Yeah. All right, so today we're going to continue the conversation about relationships with our friends and boundaries. And we're going to talk about two different types of conflict types, if you will. And so the one is the compliant manipulative controller. And then the other one we're going to talk about is the compliant non-responsive. So let's start off with the compliant manipulative controller. Sorry, my tongue gets tied with that one. So when we think about that one, how would you define that dynamic?
Yeah, so it's when the compliant person will always say yes to helping the manipulative controller with any last-minute self-induced emergencies that happen, which ends up leaving the compliant friend feeling used and exploited.
So they're like, and when you use the word emergency, let's define emergency, because you said self-induced emergency. Yeah. So can you give an example what that might be?
Well, I think of the manipulative controller not taking responsibility for things, so maybe waiting until the last minute for a paper that needs to be submitted.
Yeah.
And then calling up your friend that's pretty compliant and will just kind of come in and save the day and either write the paper for them or give them notes and just frantically trying to help.
Yeah.
When it's something that could have been completely avoided, planned.
That's good. Yeah. So they're just like, I'm going to help you. I'm here to save you. Yeah. And the other person
they're depending on that.
Yeah, they're dependent on it.
They've learned they can count on it.
Yeah.
And so it enables them to continue waiting until the last minute for things. And
so they're manipulating the situation to get what they need.
Yeah.
Yeah, so it's a good example of there's the homework. I haven't done it. I'm putting it off. Yeah. I know how I can get it done. I'll just call my friend.
Yeah.
And they'll come to my rescue.
Yeah, I think of too, like a lot of the times the manipulative side, they're not consciously trying to manipulate their friend, but they just keep getting in a jam. And so who's the first person they think of that'll fix it? Yeah,
just call them, because that's what, like you said, that's what they've learned to rely on. So they just keep defaulting to that. And so when you think, so that they continue in that cycle because it's what they know, it's what they're used to. But what are some of the symptoms we might see coming out of that relationship when you think about the two?
Some symptoms would be the compliant just continues to feel resentment towards the other side, resentment towards those last minute requests.
Yeah.
And like her friendship is being taken for granted.
Or advantage of. Yeah.
And then she might even start to avoid her friend out of it. It's pretty severe, but.
Yeah. But I mean, as you're talking about that, I'm like, I think I would feel that way if I was the compliant person and I was feeling taken advantage of, right?
Yeah.
That person is, every time they call, they're like, hey, Becca, I got me an hour and I need to get this done. I got a deadline. You'd be like, I don't know about you, but I think I'd stop taking the phone call.
I also think of the compliant person, where they came from and being taught to avoid conflict. Mm-hmm. And so it might be easier to just start avoiding their friend.
Yeah. Oh, absolutely.
Yeah.
Yeah. That was one of the things I talked about with Taylor in our coping one, is that is one of my coping mechanisms, is avoidance. So yeah. I relate, because avoiding feels comfortable at times, but it's not. It's
a false sense of safety, I think.
Oh, absolutely. Because it's just safe in that moment.
Yeah.
The stuff doesn't go away.
Exactly.
It's still there. You're just prolonging it and often making it worse.
Yeah.
So that person, that relationship becomes a lot of times strained, because it's like the only way I can stay in this relationship is if I avoid them.
Yeah.
And so instead of just having the hard conversation, I cannot do your paper for you, or I can't be your answer person. It's your responsibility. Kind of goes back to that knapsack and boulder conversation we had at the very beginning of our journey of boundaries, right?
Yep, for sure.
So, and often those roots, just like we keep talking about, it kind of comes back from the very beginning, right? So they didn't just wake up one day and say, I'm just going to be a very compliant person.
Yeah.
Nor did they wake up one day and become that manipulative controller.
Yeah.
It's something that they've experienced.
It's been established early on.
Yeah. So can you talk about some of what that might look like for that person?
Yeah. So usually in this scenario of friends, the manipulative controller's parents always rescued her from any jams she ran into, well into her 30s, you could say.
Yeah.
And never having to face the responsibility, and lacked the discipline and planning, and never was taught that. And then for the other side, the compliant didn't like growing up, she didn't like the hurt look on her mother's face whenever she would say no. And so she grew up being afraid to hurt other people's feelings and afraid of setting boundaries. And so then the compliant avoids conflict with friends or whoever it may be in her life.
Yeah. So when you look at the roots, as we've talked about the roots of all these, and you really think about those, you can see the woundedness in that person, both for the compliant and the manipulative controller, right?
Yeah.
While there's a wounding that happened early on, one might pick one as being a harder wounding than the other, but I think that can be perspective too. And when we can look at that wounding, it gives a different perspective on that relationship of why. Because for me, I love to look back at the root causes.
I do too, yeah.
Because it helps us to understand why that person does what they do. And it helps us to be able to process through the reasoning. When we can understand the reasoning, it helps us more easily, one, change our behavior, and two, understand the other person's behavior.
Yeah, and I think action for both sides will be different. You kind of have to understand why they're doing it so that you're addressing it the proper way for the specific scenario.
Yes, yeah, because everyone's going to be different of how you need to address it. So that kind of takes us to the idea of that conflict, right? And then the ownership for each side. So why don't you talk a little bit about the conflict that ensues in that boundary, or the boundary conflict that ensues, and then how do they take ownership over that? If you can kind of talk about those two, and we'll talk back and forth.
Yeah, so we mentioned it a little bit, was just the controller side doesn't plan ahead and take responsibility for tasks she might know needs to get done. And so then naturally the responsibilities will just get away from her, and she'll forget and wait till the last minute. And then ends up reaching out for the nearest compliant, I guess you could say.
Yeah.
Or the specific friend in this scenario, and then the compliant comes running.
Yeah.
And so for the ownership side of this, the compliant needs to realize how their never-ending yes is contributing to the pattern and the illusion that the controller never has to plan ahead, I guess is what the manipulative controller is thinking.
Yeah.
And I think we've mentioned this before too, but the compliant trying to get out of that victim mentality and to stop thinking that they're the victim and that they can have the power and take responsibility for their no.
Yeah. Be able to say that no clearly and be able to say that it takes time to learn that. So as we have that conflict of the boundary, I'm thinking of that, as you were talking about that friend that just calls at the last minute, needing the help, and then that boundary's been crossed, and that has that conflict between the two. The other one wants to avoid, the one needs the help. Yeah. I think about how interesting it is that we all have these unspoken roles. Yeah. And we tend to, because we've kind of learned these roles early on, we fall into them. And it just becomes like almost this natural response mechanism over time. And so that's where I think why this is so challenging for so many people when we talk about boundaries is they're like, I don't understand. This is all I've ever done. This is all I've ever known. And that's why we're spending so much time talking about this, because the things that we're talking about that people do naturally, they do it naturally because that's what they know. It feels natural to them. And that's why it's such a challenge to change the boundary. And so, because I just kept thinking about, man, it's just such a natural, because you're talking about how the manipulative controller goes out and finds that compliant person, if you will. Yeah. And it's interesting how those two just kind of go together, if you will, and how they almost like they're magnets, and they just go and they find each other and they just come to each other because they know their role and they know it well. Yeah,
not even on purpose, but
right, because it's not like we walk around name tags. Hi, my name is. Yeah.
I'm a compliant. I'll do everything for you.
Right. We don't know that. Nobody's wearing a sign, but there is almost like this unspoken magnetism, and it's because that innate desire to, as a compliant, I want to find somebody I can be compliant with. Yeah. Even though it's a friction within inside of us, and the manipulative controller, they're trying to find someone to fill that need for them to be able to have everything taken care of. So it's very interesting. And if you're in that space, you might be thinking about, well, how do I get out of that? So let's give them some action steps of what can they do with that?
Yeah. So it's a common theme that I'm starting to see too, for each side of every friendship conflict, that you never want to just start setting boundaries without finding a support system first. And you always want to practice with those safe people. Yes. And throughout that, it'll empower you to be confident in your no. Yeah. And to be okay if somebody doesn't respond okay back. And so that's definitely, I think, the first step. And then throughout that, you continue making those steps with people standing behind you.
That's really important. I love the idea of the practicing, especially with somebody who's safe. Because the more we do practice, the more natural it becomes too. Yeah. As you think about anything that you've taken on that we've learned, if you're maybe swimming, I think would be as an example that pops in my head. If you go swimming, if you're not a strong swimmer, the more you practice swimming, the more you do that activity, the better you become at it. And the stronger swimmer you'll become because you put the practice and the intentionality into it. You learn that skill. It's the same with the boundaries that we're talking about. Find somebody safe to help you through that, just like you'd find a coach when you're practicing. If you're trying to be really intentional with learning how to swim, you're going to find a swim coach. They're going to teach you how to do everything. They're going to teach you the right strokes and all the things. You need to find somebody who's a good coach or somebody who's a good counselor or a mentor that can say, I'm going to walk with you on how to do boundaries. But make sure you find somebody who knows how to do boundaries correctly, not just is going to because you don't want them to lead you incorrectly.
Yeah, opposite way.
Yeah. So you want to find that accountability partner who understands boundaries. So then that takes us into the next conflict type in the friendship boundary dynamic, which is the compliant non-responsive. So can you, Becca, explain or define what that is?
Yeah. So in this one, this is where the compliant feels like they do most of the work in the relationship. And we're seeing a common theme here again, I feel like, with the compliance side.
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah. And that it's more important to them than the non-responsive, because they're doing more of the work. And then on the other side, the non-responsive may be wondering what the problem is. They might be a little oblivious to it.
Yeah.
Because they're not doing as much of the work, they don't know.
Like, what's the big deal?
Yeah.
Like, everything feels fine to me.
Yeah.
Yeah. So when I look at that relationship, sometimes those compliants, they might tend to have a little bit of feelings of depression. Maybe they might be resentful. They might even think like, gosh, I'm really unimportant because they're not getting acknowledged, right? Because the other person's unresponsive.
Being prioritized.
Yeah. Like, I don't feel special.
Yeah.
And it's not like we're saying they need to be put on a pedestal. We're just saying they need to feel valued.
Yeah. There's no balance in the relationship.
Yeah, absolutely. So they're not feeling that. So the non-responsive, though, they might feel overwhelmed because their friend has so many needs and demands. They're like, what is wrong? They're constantly needing something from me.
Yeah.
But they're kind of disconnected almost, it sounds like.
And that makes me think, too, for the compliance side, like how hard of a feeling that could be to feel like a needy. That's such a negative term, too.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, because we don't want to, I think most people don't want to feel like they're needy.
Yeah.
Because that feels, like you said, negative. Yeah. So I think, again, we can probably at this time, most people can guess where the roots are. I mean, if you've been listening to us any amount of time by now, you're like, I know what they're going to say, where the roots started. And, it goes back to how we were formed in those early relationships. But there's also some more to that. So can you explain a little bit about that, the root part of?
Yeah, so here the compliant is fearing that if they don't do all the work, that they're going to be abandoned. And that's a hard one. That's tough.
A big one.
Yeah. And then so they work harder, and they become a worker rather than a lover, I guess you could say.
Yeah.
They're working to keep that relationship rather than genuinely loving and doing things like out of the kindness of their heart.
Because if I do enough, they'll keep me here and they won't leave me.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And then the other side of that, the non-responsive has never had to work for relationships, and they might passively, they just take from important relationships, and there's never been any friction before. They've never lost anybody by not being responsive.
Yeah. So that non-responsive person, they've never really had to work super hard to keep the relationship around. Like you said, they're passive. So I would imagine that the other person is working really hard to try to keep them around, but then that causes that friction. Like, why are they working? Because working that really hard, I think, from the compliant side probably feels needy from the non-responsive side.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's an interesting dynamic.
It is. But I can see when you talked about that abandonment side, I can think about someone who maybe was brought up in a family dynamic where they maybe had avoidant parents, or maybe there was a parent who left them, or there was a break in a relationship growing up. And so they're thinking, man, if I could have just done more, I could have kept my family intact. That might not be how they think now, but sometimes as a kid, you have that thought, man, if I just would have been better, more compliant, better behaved,
they would have stayed.
Yeah, they would have stayed together. Or if I could have been better behaved, maybe they wouldn't have fought as much.
Yeah.
And as kids, sometimes we take on the weight of something that's not ours to take on. What happens is our brain translates that and goes, yep, see what you got to do. Now you have to do the rest of your life. You have to do all the things.
Yeah, if you want people to stick around.
Yeah, because if not, they're going to leave you.
Yeah, what a lie.
Yeah, yeah. And it's something that I think a lot of people hold on to that. Especially as we've worked with women here, I hear that in a lot of women's hearts as they've been through their own struggles. Is, man, I'm going to be left alone. I'm going to be. I think that's one of our biggest fears as humans, is to be left alone.
Yeah, I think so too.
Yeah, 'cause, what if? Because I think we equate not being alone, so having company and companionship, with love.
Value,
yeah. I'm loved, I'm valued if
somebody's here for me.
And if not, and I've been abandoned, left alone, then I'm not valued. So I just encourage you, if this is where you're at and you're listening to this, man, this is heavy. And today, this is a little heavy today. And often it is when we're in the podcast room, because the topics we talk about aren't easy to walk through, but they're necessary. Because if we don't start picking at those little spots and poking at it a little bit, not in a mean way, but to say, hey, there's something we need to look at, then we're not going to be able to work on that. And that's what we really want to do, because we keep talking about that intentionality, being very intentional and purposeful as we walk through our own stories to heal, because we can't heal if we don't work through them. One of the things I'm being reminded of that we say here at Peace Restored is, and part of our mission is that we want women to learn how to work through their trauma, their difficulty, because we believe that each person has a God-designed purpose. And you can walk into that God-designed purpose when you know who you are. And part of that is by working through your boundaries and knowing who that is, knowing who you are, knowing what you believe in, what you need to hold steady. That takes us to the boundary conflicts and the ownership aspects for this friendship dynamic, which is the compliant, non-responsive. So can you expand a little bit on that, Becca?
Yeah, so the conflict here is that the compliant takes on too much responsibility for the friendship, and that the non-responsive doesn't take enough responsibility. And they kind of have the mindset, why work when somebody else will?
Right. Yeah. I mean, when you think about it from that side, right, if everybody else is doing all the work, why would you? You're like, so it just kind of feeds into that ideology that, if everybody else is doing it, then I might as well continue the road I'm on. It just keep doing what I'm doing.
Enabling that behavior.
It absolutely enables. That's a good word. But then on the other hand, we talk about the compliant takes on too much responsibility for that friendship. Everything is theirs to do. Everything. And I just think about that, how exhausting that has to feel.
Yeah, it would.
Pretty exhausting. So what are some ownership things that they need? When we think about the ownership, what do they need to own?
Yeah, so the compliant needs to take responsibility for making it too easy on the non-responsive. And then they also need to become aware that their attempts to do all the work are coming from a disguised attempt to control love, which is tough. Yeah,
that is tough, right? And so when we think about this relationship of friends and the compliant, non-responsive, and I'm just going to say that if you're listening to this, friends is a broad term, right? Yeah. So it can be any type of friend relationship, that there's things that both parties need to take responsibility for. Right? Whether you're the compliant or the non-responsive, you have things you need to take responsibility for. And that's the same with any of the things that we've been talking about through all this, these last few series on boundaries, is there are parts that we need to take responsibility for, regardless of what side of the fence you're on. So if you're listening to this, don't listen to this as we're trying to make one person out to be the bad guy over the other. Now, there often is one person or the other will have more to work on than the other, but we both always have room for improvement. And so we want to make sure that we're addressing our our side of the fence, like we talk about in the boundaries. We have to work on our side of the fence, and they have to work on their side of the fence. Yeah. Our job is not to fix them. Their job is not to fix us. We can only work on ourselves. Right. And so that kind of brings us to the action steps that we can take. There's several action steps we can take, or ways that we can take action, because again, we want to implement what we're learning, not just take in knowledge. Mm-hmm. So how can we take action if we're in the compliant, non-responsive relationship?
Yeah, so once again, too, because the compliant is the one that's unhappy in the relationship, and the non-responsive doesn't really see anything wrong because they're not putting in that effort. The compliant is the one that needs to take the first step and reach out to some other supportive friends and practice setting those limits. And then when they are finally able to confront the non-responsive and set that boundary, then the non-responsive has to do their share of the work, or they risk losing the relationship. Yeah. And throughout that process is where the compliant will learn whether or not they had a mutual connection in the first place. Yeah. And if not, then it might be time for them to grieve and move on to find some real mutual connection, friendships, I guess you could say.
I think that there's a couple of things that pop in my head as you were talking. One is, it is important that sometimes every relationship cannot be saved. Yeah. It's okay if a relationship ends. If you are setting healthy boundaries and that person leaves you, that's a them problem, not a you problem.
Absolutely. They weren't really a true friend to you in the first place.
They're not in a healthy place where they can be that friend that you need. Yeah. And so it's okay to grieve, as you said, because we do need to grieve that relationship and let it go.
Yeah. It's disappointing to lose somebody that you maybe hoped could be a really good friend to you.
Yeah. It's okay. I think the other thing that was popping into my mind as you were talking is, there's a theme, and what we've been saying is it's almost always the compliant needs to be the one to do the work. And they might be screaming at us right now going, I'm already doing all the work.
Well, yeah, it's hard to think of it that way. I kind of think of just not all the work. They just have to make the first step.
Yeah, and I agree. But I think I'm
adding
thinking
it to their list of what they're already doing.
Yeah, because they're already sitting there going, man, I'm already doing the bulk of everything, because they're the compliant person, right? They're picking up all the weight. Yeah. But I think the big reason that pops in my head why they need to usually be the first one that takes this first step is because they're the one that needs to surround themselves with safe people.
Yeah, and they're currently allowing those harmful relationships to just surround them and get worse.
Yeah, so they're typically, the compliant person has unsafe people around them. Yeah. Which, if you don't know what a safe person is, we have a podcast on that, so you can go listen to it. But if you're that compliant person, you have unsafe people around you. So the reason why we want you to step out first is because you need to surround yourself with safe people. You need to find people that can be that soft place to land before things get worse. Because ultimately when we set boundaries, things a lot of times get worse before they get better. Yeah. And that can be scary, but I encourage you just to keep pressing on, to keep push forward, because it'll be okay. It will get better eventually. And some relationships will end. We're not saying everything's going to be rosy and perfect, but the way you relate to people and how it affects you as an individual will get better. Yeah. And how you're, again, if we go back to that purpose statement we had earlier, is because of that, you're going to be able to live out your God-designed purpose, because you're going to know who you are, who you were designed to be, and that you were designed for a purpose, and that you are loved and you have value and all those things. And so find somebody safe that you can talk to that can help you through this. And that's not saying that if you are on the other side of the fence that you don't need to find somebody safe to help you through. Absolutely, 100% you do. But I think that compliant person might need a little bit different grouping first, because that's just the way that it works. Yes. So again, thank you, Becca, for joining us today as we continued our conversation on boundaries. It's been a really good conversation today.
Yeah, it has.
I hope people have enjoyed our conversation. Throughout this year, we're going to continue to have more podcasts on the topic of boundaries. And so just keep coming back. If this has been a topic that you've enjoyed, let us know in the comments, or, please reach out to us. We'd love to hear your feedback, because we're not just doing this for our own benefit. While we do, as an office, gain a lot from learning on these topics together, because while we all work in mental health here at Peace Restored, we are growing together with you, as Becca said earlier. But we're not doing this just for our own sake. We want this to be a benefit to our listeners. Yeah. So please give us some feedback. Let us know what you're thinking of these. Hopefully we're getting better over time and not worse, but because we're trying to hone our skills on podcasting. I think we're at least getting more comfortable behind the mic, at least. But we're working on getting better at producing better content for you. So with that, if you are looking to learn more about Peace Restored, if you want to go to our website, which is peacerestored.net, we'll also have more information on our show notes for you to check out, where you'll find some links, additional content, and some videos. Like I said, over the next few weeks, we'll be producing more podcasts for you, so keep coming back to hear more. You can also go on our website to see more content, and if you want to reach out to our staff, if you are a woman over the age of 18, we'd be happy to schedule an appointment for you. Join us on our next podcast, where we will continue to discuss mental health and faith. So come back next time for transformation, growth, and power. This is Peace Restored.